to share with us today. And I'm going to introduce our special guest and speaker today. She was a teacher at Reed Patillo Elementary and the middle school here in New Smyrna for over 30 years. And then after she was done working, she went back to work for the News Journal, where I know she did some photography work for them, and she wrote stories on Oak Hill and the local area. Please join me in welcoming Marie Goodrich.
Thank you so very much for coming. All right, Oak Hill is the southernmost city in Volusia County. It joins Brevard County on the south, and on the east of Oak Hill is Mosquito Lagoon. This is a saltwater lagoon that's near the head of the Indian River, and there's been commercial fishing in it for many years, and it also is very, very beautiful. Now, Oak Hill has a long history, and of course this goes back to the Indians, as many as does all of our country here. And the Europeans began to come about in the 1500s, and one of the artists that came with them took a picture of an Indian village that was near Oak Hill. And so, as you know, its name, Oak Hill, obviously would come from live oak trees. And so do we have a picture of of the shell mounds here? Right along Mosquito Lagoon, there used to be many shell mounds, and many of these had become covered with dirt, and there were huge live oak trees on it. Well, people from the north wanted to make big ships, and so they came to Oak Hill and cut down the oak trees that were on these hills that were near the river, and then they floated the big logs up to the inlet. I can't even imagine what that must have been like, floating those big logs up to the inlet, but then there were ships that took them north, and they were used in shipbuilding. At first they called it Live Oak Hill, and then they just began to say Oak Hill, so it's been Oak Hill ever since. Florida became a state in 1845, of course, and then British and American settlers began to come here. And we do have records of a family that was living just north of Oak Hill, and some Indians killed 4 people there. Another one found them. And of course the Seminole Wars went on during that time, but things kind of got settled with the Indians, and then the Civil War came. Well, of course, Florida was a state by then, and so Florida fought on the side of the Confederacy. And in Oak Hill, there were some salt works and a few stores. And the local cemetery has 11 Civil War veterans that are buried there. 5 of them were Union, and 6 were Confederate. But much of Oak Hill's growth occurred after the Civil War, because the state and federal government was encouraging this. And you could get grants of 80 to 160 acres, or you could buy land for $1.25 an acre. So people began to settle here. And transportation still was by water mostly. And of course Eldora is across from Oak Hill, and that was a more important place than Oak Hill at this time. One of the important places in Oak Hill in the early days was a hunting lodge, because, of course, with all the woods around there, there was a lot of hunting going on. And this particular one was built in 1880, and it was called Atlantic House. And maybe one of the reasons it was so popular, there were only 2 places in the county that had a liquor license. And this hotel was one of them. And, but it eventually was destroyed by fire. It was operated by Frank Sams, and there are also Sams in New Smyrna, as we know. All right, now I want to talk a little bit about oranges. The first orange grove in Oak Hill was by a teacher who was named Mr. Mitchell, and it was one of the earliest orange groves anywhere in Florida. But by 1892, there were about 130 acres of grove land here, so that became very, very important. Well, along in 1872, the Goodrich family came from North Florida, and they claimed 168 acres, and they started raising cattle and planted orange groves. And one of the older members, Axon Quarterman Goodrich, said, "You gotta have something growing while you're sleeping." So he thought growing oranges was a pretty good idea. But then commercial fishing started being important because of Mosquito Lagoon had so many fish in it. And so Axon said, orange groves only pay off once a year, but fishing put money in your pocket 12 months a year. So the Goodriches decided they'd go into the fishing business, which lasted for a long time. This is the Goodrich Fish House. It is at the same, it was a commercial fishing business with men fishing for them. And at that time, the fishermen got 3 cents a pound for mullet. That was the main thing. And you had to fish at night. That was a hard life. My dad was a fisherman, so I know about what that is like. Well, this went on for a long time, and things were really good, but my father-in-law, Jeff Goodrich, kept negotiating with the legislature and other people. He was afraid they would outlaw the kind of nets that they used in Oak Hill, the gill nets, and they finally did. And so that ended the commercial fishing in Oak Hill. And it was quite a loss for the city. That's just me at the fish house. Now, one of the interesting places in Oak Hill is Seminole Wrist. And Seminole Wrist is now part of the Canaveral Seashore Park, although it is on the Oak Hill side rather than on the beach side there. And this was built by an English couple, and there had been all these huge shell mounds along the river, and most of them were used to build roads, but the family that built Seminole Wrist would not let them use those, so those particular shell mounds are still there now. Well, one of the things that became very important for Oak Hill was the railroad, because now here they had oranges and they had fish, and if they could ship them, they could of course sell much more. So this was real important. Of course, steam engines were what were used most of the time, but finally they had a streamliner named the Champion. This didn't stop in Oak Hill, but it came through. And it was so important, they let school out, and all of us school children walked over to the depot to see the Champion train. we thought that was very important. At that time, you could ride the steam engine train, which came by once a day for 10 cents to New Smyrna. So every once in a while, we'd ride to New Smyrna. If you took the bus, the Florida Motor Line, that cost 25 cents. But that was two ways that we could get to New Smyrna. Now, this picture shows the Oak Hill Depot, and it was a pretty good sized depot, and they had a telegraph station. Then not many people had phones, so if someone died or if something unusual happened, you would get a telegram that would be delivered to you there.
Is it still there?
No, it's not there anymore. It was destroyed. This is an orange packing house. You can see this Oak Hill Citrus Growers Association, and you can see that this is a very large building because the shipping oranges was very, very important during that time. Now we have another picture here that shows inside the packing house. Many women, housewives that didn't ordinarily work, would work in the fall when it was time to start picking the oranges, and they would grade them, and you can see that this was a very large enterprise here. There also was a packing house in Shiloh, which was south of Oak Hill. Unfortunately, hard freezes put an end to the orange groves and also citrus canker. So without fishing and without oranges, Oak Hill would have been a very bad spot. But Cape Kennedy came along, and many of them got jobs at the Cape, so that sort of saved Oak Hill. Now, some of you have noticed that I had a bottle here, and it was not for me. This was to tell you about an interesting time in Oak Hill when we had the whiskey business. And this was during Prohibition. Prohibition came about in 1920, and it outlawed the manufacture, sale, or transportation of alcohol. But it brought a new kind of business to Oak Hill. Because if you think about, we had Oak Hill with what we call the river, or Mesquite Lagoon, and then we had what is now Canaveral Seashore Park, and then we had the ocean. And so ships came in from other places like Bimini, England, Scotland, and Cuba, and some of the local people went over to the Bahamas. My dad was one of them, over to the West End, and they would bring alcohol in here, unload it from the ocean, then just transport it on the land over to the river part and put it on flat boats, bring it to Oak Hill, and there were all these cars waiting with false trucks and so forth. And so this was quite a prosperous business. Now, unfortunately for Oak Hill, this ended in 1933, and so it was now legal to do this, but Oak Hill had been one of the major ports for illegal entry. Well, the thing I want to talk about now is World War II, and I was 14 at the time of World War II, and I still have my diary that I was writing when I was 14. And it was a Sunday when the Japanese dropped the bombs on Pearl Harbor. So it was just an ordinary Sunday. Dear Diary, this morning after Sunday school was over, we went to Shiloh to hear an African missionary speak. Now, I don't know whether you all know where Shiloh is or not, but Shiloh was south of Oak Hill, and over toward the east, and it was taken over by Cape Kennedy and became part of Cape Kennedy. So all those people and houses had to be moved, and so it no longer exists. But that's where I had gone on Sunday morning. Very interesting. And then I write, today's a historic occasion. Japan has bombed Hawaii and the Philippines. Mary Frida, Helena, Betty, Ann, Ida, and I were playing hand tennis in the road when Mr. and Mrs. Burns told us, everyone's listening to war broadcast. Well, we had never heard of Pearl Harbor, which of course is in Hawaii, but by coincidence, Mrs. Burns, who heard about it on the radio, her brother was in the Navy and he was at Pearl Harbor. So she was very upset about that. Well, when World War II came along, it changed things quite a bit. Over on the table I have some ration coupons and so forth. And some of the things that were rationed were paper and sugar and meats and shoes and things of that sort. And one of the things that the government decided that they should do for defense was keep track of all the airplanes that were flying along the coast. And so they decided that they would make some coastal watchtowers. So anyone who, and these were to be manned 24 hours a day to keep track of every plane that came by. And so anyone that was interested took a course and learned to identify the different kinds of planes. And even though I was just 14, people of every age took the course. And we became watchtower volunteers. Well, they wanted to put the tower wherever the highest place was in town. And in Oak Hill, that was the packing house that you saw the picture of. And so we would volunteer for several hours in which we would be up there reporting every plane that came by. And we would call Tampa. And we would say one biplane or monoplane. Oak Hill's code was SEAL 27, and then we would say what direction it was going, and they would check. There never was a plane that wasn't supposed to be there, so this is our. But one of the big deals about doing this was that there are only 2-3 phones in town, and we got to use the telephone. So this was a big deal for us. Now, this is the school that I went to in Oak Hill. There were schools of various kinds before this, including one where a man had a school for white children in the morning and black children in the afternoon. But this particular one had 10 grades, 1 through 10. And to finish school, as I did, you rode a bus to New Smyrna and went to the 11th and 12th grade. Well, a lot of the boys just quit school after the 10th grade. And so that was a big deal, graduating from the 10th grade. The girls wore long dresses, and it was really a big deal. Well, eventually, the county, this building was destroyed. There was another school, but eventually the county decided there would not be any more schools in Oak Hill. Well, Oak Hill people didn't like this bit, and so they decided they were going to have school anyway. And so the community trust decided that they would set up what is called a STEM school: science, technology, engineering, and math. And this school has really done well. It's had an A rating right along, and there are now I don't know, somewhere from 400 to 600 students that are there, and they have a waiting list just as long as the number of students. So Oak Hill School is doing well. Now, this is what was Baldwin's store in Oak Hill. It was on top of the hill in the same location where the post office is now in Oak Hill. And this big building and an adjoined building where the family lived. Well, Labor Day, the Baldwins decided they'd all go to the beach. So they all went to the beach, and there was a fire in the house and the store, and the entire place by the time they got home had burned down. Well, Oak Hill didn't have any fire department, of course, and so New Smyrna came, but my sister and I thought that was the end of the world. We walked over to watch that burning, and it was a very sad thing. This is another store. That was the Goodrich's store that they also had in Oak Hill. Now, Oak Hill started a city government in 1927, but the Depression came along. So in 1930 they disbanded it, and it was not officially a city again until 1962. And Clarence Goodrich was the city's mayor from 1963 to 1989. He served 26 years without pay, and that's the longest any mayor in Florida has ever served. He was married to my sister, and we married first cousins. Not our first cousins, but first cousins to each other. So Oak Hill still has that mayor city form of government, but they don't have a police force anymore. They disbanded their police force and let the county take over the police force. This is the Oak Hill Post Office. Things were very boring in the summer in Oak Hill, and so it was a big deal for the kids and for many of the other people too to go over and meet the trains. There were 2 trains that were going to bring the mail. 29 brought mail from the north, and 30 brought mail from the south. And so we would be over at the depot as they unloaded the mail, and then they'd bring it back to the post office. And here you see one of the Hilldales that's putting it up. And we were all waiting to see if we had any mail. And Mr. Hilldale would finally raise up that glass there and say, "Read 'em and weep." And that was an exciting thing for us. This is the Oak Hill Baptist Church, which was the largest church, and there was just a vacant lot between it and our house. And so anytime the doors were open, we were at the church, of course, and that church eventually was moved and destroyed, so that particular building is not there anymore, even though there is a Baptist church. This is an old Goodrich home that the family lived in for many, many years. And the next picture is a relative. I was a Simmons, and this is William Abraham Simmons. He was one of the first Simmonses to come here, the first one, I guess. And the way he got here, he rode a raft from Jacksonville down to this area and had 9 children and lived here. And the next picture is some of the Oak Hill relatives. That is my dad with the hat to the right. and my mother beside him. And my dad was born in what was called Hawks Park. That's Edgewater now. And Dr. Hawks, who founded that, made a journal and wrote down the name of everybody who was in town. It's still at the Edgewater City Hall now. And my dad's name is there, and his family as early relatives of Oak Hill. And apparently his maternal grandfather had fought in the Seminole Wars, because we have a record of him applying for a pension. My dad was a woodsman and spent a lot of time in the woods, and the worst thing happened was that when my mother was expecting her second child, Daddy was out in the woods and he got bit by a rattlesnake. He was riding a horse. Well, in those days, they sort of knew what to do. So what he did, he got out his knife and he cut where the rattlesnake had bit. He sucked the poison out. Luckily, I guess he had good teeth. And he put a tourniquet on it. And then he came back to Oak Hill and changed his shirt, and there was one car in Oak Hill at the time, so he got the man with the one car to carry him up to Hawks Park where there was a hospital, and he survived. So my mother always said she never worried about him. If he could survive a rattlesnake bite, he could survive anything. So growing up in Oak Hill was interesting, and there were about 500 people there, so you knew everybody, black or white, good or bad, and I can't think of a better way to understand people than growing up in a place like Oak Hill. So it was beautiful, it was interesting, and I really loved it. So thank you so much for coming. Anybody have any questions?
I do. The
Okay.
fishing of mullets happened at night. Why do you fish for mullets at night? Do you have any idea? Only at night.
Well, they always did. I don't know. They would take a bucket to take their food, you know, and they just had small boats with motors on them. But any night the weather was good, you went fishing, because you didn't get any money. If if the weather was bad for a week, you got no money at all. That's why I decided I was going to be a teacher. I was not going to be anything unless you got paid regularly. Yes.
And now, Goodrich Seafood Restaurant, is
Yes.
that still your family?
Yes,
Oh,
yes.
nice.
A brother-in-law started. The family doesn't actually run it. It's run by the people that do catfish in Port Orange. But the family still has a connection. And Larry Zonka, the football player, who's a family friend, he actually owns the land. So I had a small piece of property near there that I sold to him because it was only good for parking. Yeah.
Miss Goodrich, where was that that school, the old school that you showed that was 2 stories or whatever?
Yes.
Where was that at exactly?
The same spot where the Oak Hill School is.
Where Burns School
now.
is?
Yes,
Okay.
yes, it's at the same
Okay.
location. Yes,
Were people doing turpentining in the Oak Hill, west of Oak Hill? Or?
yes, but it never was a big deal
Okay.
as far as I knew about it at least, but they did do some
Yeah, maybe it was
turpentining, yes.
further west and south or something.
Yes, yes, yes.
You mentioned the 3 telephones in town during the Second World War. And it piques my interest about, what about running water, electricity, etc.?
I'm sorry, I can't hear.
Running water and electricity.
He was curious, he said you had mentioned that there was just
The
3
utilities.
phones in town during the
Yeah.
World War II, and he was curious about accessibility to utilities like water and electricity.
Well, people had their own pumps and septic tanks and so forth. The city still doesn't have that. There, people still just have their own.
Wells.
And so, if you wanted to use a phone, there was one like at Goodest Store. My father-in-law Jeff Goodrich had one, and so I don't know who else, some other businessman. But you just went and asked them to borrow the phone. But mostly they did telegrams, you know. And
Did they have electricity down there?
Huh?
Electricity?
Yes.
Oh.
Now, families that could afford it had electricity. During the Depression, some did not, but mostly they did by then. And we would have blackouts every once in a while, you know, part of the war.
You went well beyond 10th grade. Where'd you get your teaching degree?
Huh?
Where'd you get your teaching degree?
Okay, I went to Florida State, and it started out Florida State College for Women, but then the war ended, and so many men came back that the University of Florida, which was for men only, could not accommodate all the men, and so they made them both co-ed. So I started at Florida State College for Women, but I graduated from Florida State University.
What year?
And then in 1949. And then I later on went to Stetson and got my master's degree from Stetson in 1960.
About the story about how your class named the football team. That's my favorite one. That's hard to say, that y'all got to
Yes.
vote on the football
Can
team.
you tell us a little bit about what it was like to be working on the News Journal as a photographer and
All right, well, the News Journal had a bureau here in New Smyrna, and they put out little separate editions in this area and DeLand and Bunnell and various places like that. And so I wrote a regular column from Oak Hill every week. And before that, when I was in high school, I worked for the other newspaper, the New Smyrna Beach News, and I wrote an Oak Hill column. At that time, there was no news. So if people went to Daytona, that was news. but by the time I worked for the News Journal, I just did regular news. I wrote a regular Oak Hill column, and then if they assigned me to an art show or something like that, I would take pictures and write a story
you did
about
some
that.
photography of your own.
Huh?
You did some photography of your own.
Yes, I did quite a bit of photography, and I was in art shows in the park and over on the beach side, the Flamingo Follies. So that was fun after I retired from teaching, so there was some other things to do. Anyone else?
So was there a story related to the University of Florida and naming the mascot for the team? She
The
was
football
I
team.
don't
the
know.
football team.
You
Florida
had told
State.
me once that your class got to vote on the football team's
Oh,
name.
yeah, that's true. We now had a football team now that we were co-ed, and we voted. I don't remember what all the choices were, but I remember one of the choices was Florida Crackers, and I'm glad we didn't get that. You know, at the time, that was not, people don't like that now, but at the time, I thought I was a Florida Cracker. But I'm glad that we became the Seminoles, and the Seminoles are happy that we saved that team. So that's still my favorite team, but it's not doing good this year.
Hasn't done good since my daughter graduated.
Yeah, your daughter went there.
Yeah, when they were champions.
Yeah, when they're
It
champions,
was fun. She
right.
said it was the best
Yeah.
time to go to school.
So you have an inside bathroom or an outside bathroom?
She wanted to know at your house when you grew up if you had an indoor bathroom or an outside one.
I'm sorry to say we had an outdoor one. And we did not have, our particular family did not have electricity until I was 12 years old. And I tell you, that was really one. We had two lamps. Talk about togetherness. My dad was fishing, and so it would be my mother, and I had an older brother and sister who had left home by then. And so it was my mother and my sister and I. So we were very close.
Does Oak Hill have any industry today?
Well, there still are people who work at the Cape, but I wouldn't say, you know, the oranges and fishing are no longer, so there's no real industries that I can think of. People just have various jobs.
What about the boat, the Boston Whalers? Are they in Edgewater or Oak Hill?
Edgewater.
Oh, they're in Edgewater, where they build the Boston Whaler boats.
Yeah, Boston Whaler,
They're
right,
in
some of them do
Edgewater.
work there, that's near Edgewater, but, yeah. Anyone else?
All right.
Thank you.
Wonderful audience, thank you so much.
We thank you all for coming and joining us this afternoon, and look forward to seeing you at some of our programming. If we don't catch you for dinner on Monday night at McKenna's, come join us next month for programming, or join us at our Christmas party. And as always, if you enjoy our programming at the museum, please visit our donation box on your way out so we can continue to provide this type of entertainment to the community. Thank you so much.